So, are we currently in a state of mass psychosis? It's a good question. Let's look at it. Mass psychosis. What is it? It's when a large population of the people are in a state of delusion. And that state of delusion creates a lot of problems like we're seeing now. As you can see, we're currently living in a situation where a good portion of the population believes very strongly about one thing, such as the belief in the pandemic and whether the vaccines work or not, and whether this is all justified in lockdowns. And then we have the other half, which believe this is all just a way of tyranny. And there's a lot of resistance. I think the most obvious example of this we're seeing today is in Australia. And if you've been following the news, or at least not so much the mainstream news, but alternative news, that the kind that you see on, maybe not even on YouTube, but you see in other places, you will have seen that in Australia, the level of dystopian state of government there, where the military and security forces are really beating down on the people, that the division is so hard that we're starting to see this police state in a way that we've never seen before. Things that we would normally say that this is something that happens in some developing countries, some tin pot dictator. Now we're witnessing this sort of behavior in a Western country like Australia. How does this happen? How do we get to a state where this amount of violence and dystopian behavior comes about, if not from the fact that there are two sides that are heavily invested in their mindset that are completely opposite to each other? And how can this really exist? How can this go on? How does this resolve itself when you have two diametrically opposing point of views that are so strong, that are so firm, that they cannot coexist? And so therefore the result is this conflict, and the conflict not just being verbal, the conflict becoming violent. So how was it before? So before the mass psychosis, we had a functioning society where if we disagreed with each other, we would find a way to resolve the disagreement through debate, through discussion, through critical thinking, etc. These tools that we have within ourselves enable us to resolve conflicts and come to some kind of understanding where we can all coexist in a happy way which satisfies both parties, and we could all just get along with our lives. However, today that's not the case. We don't have that capacity to really debate and dialogue ourselves through this crisis. So what ends up happening is that we hold on to these beliefs, that these beliefs become really entrenched, the division becomes really, really strong and deep. And sometimes this is actually fueled by things like social media and mainstream media that fuel fear, that censor certain groups, that push one narrative versus another. And therefore we create this petri dish of conflict, and the conflict becomes so intense that it needs to find a channel. And the channel often eventually, if it doesn't resolve itself in a peaceful way, such as through debate and dialogue, bleeds into violence. So what you're witnessing in Australia and other parts of the world, such as France and parts of Europe, etc., is this outpouring, this channeling of psychosis, because it has to resolve itself. And because one side, the government or the state, wants to impose its laws, its draconian edicts on the people with such severity, in a way, it's completely delusional, because history shows time after time that this does not succeed. But the state is so delusional and so entrenched in its psychosis that it doesn't know how to get out, doesn't know how to stop, doesn't know how to get off this path. On the other hand, the people are waking up more and more and more. So maybe a year, 2 years ago, a majority of the people were traumatized. They were scared. They were fearful, because they actually believed that they were going to die from this pandemic and so forth. And so they listened to the state and were able to sacrifice a lot of their freedoms and their jobs and all the other things that came with it, to stay safe, so to speak. But increasingly, the people are discovering that this is not the case. That there are a lot of contradictions and hypocrisies going on. And these are coming to light every day, every week. We're noticing that more and more people are waking up and realizing that there is an enormous narrative being pushed down their throat. And now with the mandates, such as vaccine passports and digital IDs and so forth, and the fact that some countries are imposing these laws such that you can't even go to work unless you have a digital ID, then you're seeing real upheaval. And so the delusion of the state, believing that they can actually enforce this on its people, is a form of psychosis. A psychosis on their part in believing that they have ultimate power, that they can control societies with godlike ability. That is a form of delusional psychosis. On the other hand, the mass psychosis that they imposed on society is slowly waning, and people are starting to get back their critical faculties. They're starting to do the research. They're starting to understand. They're starting to realize that they're being put in chains. So that is wearing off. That psychosis is wearing off. And what is coming out of this is an enormous conflict. It's an enormous polarity, and who knows where this is going to end up. Obviously, right now, if you look at places like Australia, which is the most prominent, which is the best example, where the state with its military police are firing rubber bullets on unarmed citizens, sometimes unprovoked, attacking them the way they would do in a military operation. It's completely absurd. I mean, I don't understand how a state leader could, in their right mind, believe that they could sustain this kind of behavior over time and get the results that they're looking for. That they're going to get these people to comply by using this form of intimidation. It has never worked. Never. So that only leads me to believe that these leaders in these positions are delusional. And in a state of nature, delusion cannot exist indefinitely. Eventually, that delusion is going to lead to a breakdown, to a catharsis. And that hasn't happened yet. Something has to happen for that to occur. On the other hand, the people, the population, are waking up and they're resisting, and they're really resisting in a way that they're putting themselves in harm's way to overcome the chains that are being put on them. And they're not going to stop. You might subdue them. You might even kill them. But it's not going to stop, because the truth of the matter is never going to be extinguished. Truth will always prevail over delusion. It's like the law of nature. It's like as if you dropped an object, it will fall to the floor. It's it's that kind of thing. It's physics. So truth will ultimately prevail. In the meantime, we're going to have chaos. We're going to have violence and eruption. So it's not over. This is coming more and more to a head. In a way, it will get worse before it gets better. But it is a mass delusional psychosis that has taken over the people yet again. And it's not the first time. It's happened before. And I'm sure if you think about it, you know exactly when in history this sort of mass psychosis has happened. But it's always failed. It always collapses under its own weight. So what should we do to wait this out, to participate? I say, think for yourself, think critically. Try to keep yourself safe and dodge the bullets. But this is happening, and we're all being sucked into it. How it's going to resolve itself, we don't know. Only the future can tell. But in the meantime, try to get your faculties back. If that means unplugging yourself from media and news sources that you're used to, try to get back to your state of self. Think critically for yourself. Come back into yourself and hopefully release yourself from these preconceived notions, from these narratives that have been swimming around in our heads, and so that we could become somewhat neutral and be able to think for ourselves, think clearly for ourselves, and hopefully we can come to some new normal. The other thing we can do is create communities of like-minded people where we can, reinforce ourselves in our sanity to convince ourselves we're not going insane. We're actually, we're looking at this clearly, even though we're being demonized for it. That's another way to keep ourselves sane and thinking clearly. So take care of yourselves, and leave me a comment. Let me know what you think about this. Do you feel we're living in a mass psychosis? Are we living through an age of mass delusion? Let me know more about what you think. Thanks again.